Well, today's the official publication date of the book, so I feel that you've all come to celebrate with me. So thank you. I thought I would talk briefly about how the book came to be written and what I had in mind and what I discovered. And then I'll just read you tiny little snippets from various places in the book and talk about the context from which the snippets come. The book really began about three or 4 years ago, I think. I had begun writing a novel, from the point of view of a 13-year-old girl. And the whole point of reading like a writer, which Ruth mentioned, was that if you're going to write something, you should read something. If you're going to write something, you should read the best thing about that subject ever written. And so I asked myself, what's the best thing ever written about a 13-year-old girl? And I realized it was actually the best thing ever written by a 13-year-old girl, and it was The Diary of Anne Frank. So I went back and reread it, and I was struck. Of course, I'd read it as a little kid, and I loved it. I mean, I figured out when I was writing this that I was about 8 or 9 when I read it for the first time. I was like most writers, I was a big, precocious reader. And I'd loved the book as a kid. But when I read it as an adult, and especially as a writer, I realized certain things that I could not have possibly known as a child. I realized just to put it simply, what a great work of literature it was. I mean, I had thought, as most people think, that it was just a kind of spontaneous diary that a little girl wrote under unimaginably terrible circumstances, and that she'd written the little Czech diary, filled it, and then when the family was arrested, the diary was found and transcribed and published and so forth. Well, what I discovered, and I'm going to read to you a section about that, was that nothing could have been further from the truth. Anne Frank was a conscious literary artist. She wanted her book to be published. She rewrote her entire book. She was very aware of literary technique, and she had, she was a natural writer, and at the same time, because she was such a reader, she had a sense of literature. So she went back and went back to the beginning during her last 4 or 5 months in the attic and rewrote the book from scratch. So all these things that I discovered as I was writing it made the book a very different book than what I'd imagined, and made me think about a book which I thought somehow that I knew everything there was to know about. It made me think about it in a completely different way, and I thought that I would write a book that would, I hoped, help readers think about it in a completely different way. The other thing that I had in mind was to try and figure out for myself, really, how this extraordinary thing had happened. That is, a book by a child, a book written by a girl between the ages of 13 and 15, how this book had become a universal and international icon, how a little girl's diary had become a book that's translated into dozens of languages, has sold tens of millions of copies, is taught in schools all over the world, and for many people is their first, especially for students, is their first introduction to the Holocaust, to that whole period of history, to what happened. So, and it seemed, if you think about it, by now we're so used to this fact that it seems obviously quite normal to us. But if you think about it for a moment, the wondrousness of it strikes you all over again. That is, a child's diary becoming this international, widely read, beloved work of literature. Also, I was struck by the fact that in 20 or 30 years, most of the people, all the people perhaps who have witnessed this time would no longer be alive, but we would still continue to know, people in the future would continue to know the names of all the millions and millions of people who were murdered. The names of those 8 people who lived in that secret annex would stay with people forever, and again, because of the work of a little girl. So I started to do research. I read the diary, I reread the diary, I started to think about the diary, and so I'll read you little bits from this, which will give you a clearer idea. I thought I would just talk, but then I thought, I've spent years trying to put it in the clearest possible way on the page, so I'm going to read little bits and then talk to you about what they come from. So here's the first. The book is organized. The sections are, well, it's, the book, the life, the afterlife. So So it begins really with an introduction, and then the life. There's a whole section about the biography of Anne Frank. And then the book, how the book was found, the publication history of the book, which was a whole other story, because as it turned out, as some of you may know, no one wanted to publish this book. No one in Amsterdam wanted to publish this book. Finally, because it was written about in a Dutch newspaper by two Dutch intellectuals, a Dutch publisher approached Otto Frank and agreed to publish it there. It came out in France and Germany, but there were no takers here in the United States and in Britain to publish it. So I'll read you a little section about that. And then once it came out, it became an instant bestseller because, well, I'll read you that too, because there was a whole long, complicated, dramatic, theatrical, and kind of awful history surrounding, basically surrounding the way in which the book got made into a play. As some of you may know, there was an American writer named Meyer Levin who was Jewish, who'd written a couple of novels and memoirs, not great successes. He was too old to enlist in the army in World War II, and so instead he joined the press corps and was present at the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, where Anne died. And he wrote later that standing over the mass graves at Bergen-Belsen, he felt that a voice would arise from the dead, really, to tell the story. And when he read the Diary of Anne Frank in French, his wife gave him a copy, the French edition, a gift which she would later come to regret. He became obsessed with Anne Frank. He began to think this was the voice he had waited to hear. So he wrote Otto Frank a letter. He became friends with Otto Frank. He offered to help Otto find an American publisher for the diary. After Otto had found a publisher, in a way that I will read to you, Meyer Levin kind of came back into the scene and said that he was the perfect person to adapt the book for the screen and for the stage. And again, as he himself said, he wrote a book about this called The Obsession. He became obsessed with the diary to the point at which he almost felt as if he had written the diary. And while he was trying to sell the book to Hollywood and to Broadway, he was agenting the book. He, at the same time, got asked for and received the assignment to review the book for the front page of the New York Times Book Review. Now, that would be a kind of definition of a conflict of interest. We don't really think that the book's agent should be reviewing them for the front page of the New York Times Book Review. But in fact, what happened was Meyer Levin wrote this rave review. By the end of that week, the book was a bestseller in the United States. And as the book became more and more popular, the people who wanted to turn it into a play began to realize that they could get very famous and very successful writers involved. Lillian Hellman became involved, Carson McCullers, Arthur Miller, and little by little, Meyer Levin was kind of edged out of the negotiations. So this resulted in lawsuits and accusations of betrayal and a kind of bitter controversy between Meyer Levin and Otto. So that's a whole section. Then there's a whole other section about the film and how the play was turned into a film. Then the book became a subject, and I have to tell you, this was the most unpleasant and difficult section for me to write. The book was taken up by Holocaust deniers who said that it was a forgery, who said that Otto Frank had written the book to make money, and I can't begin to tell you how unpleasant it was to read their just vile, disgusting accusations against Anne Frank and her father and the book. The final part of the book is about how the book has been used in the schools and taught in the schools. It's one of the most widely taught books in the United States. It's also one of the most widely censored books in the United States, and for all sorts of reasons. And finally, the last chapter, which I'll read you a little bit of, I taught the book. I teach at Bard College. I teach a class in close reading at Bard. And I decided to teach the book to my class, and this was a particularly wonderful class. I adored my students, and they were wonderful readers. And I thought, well, these are, you know, they're 20-year-olds, 21, 22. They're incredibly smart and well-read and good readers. And I wanted to see how they responded to the diary after all these years.